Chapter 1. Polished Shoes, Unpolished Minds. George Pembroke sat at his kitchen table, meticulously polishing his shoes in small, precise circles. The room was quiet, broken only by the soft rub of the cloth against the leather and the steady ticking of the clock above the stove. Sunlight spilled in through the half-shut blinds, catching the silver-polished tin in a faint halo. He began every morning the same way. His father had always said a well-shined shoe told you everything you needed to know about a man. George paused briefly, the cloth resting on the polished leather. It was September the 4th, the first day of term at St. Bartholomew's Academy. At 62, he was no stranger to first days. In years past, the morning had always brought a quiet anticipation, new faces, clean slates, the chance to begin again. But this year, that familiar feeling refused to land. Something in him felt unbalanced, like a melody that kept missing the note it was reaching for. At the end of last term, there was news that a new academy trust, Forward Thinking Alliance, had taken over the school. It was well known across the region for radical shake-ups, aggressive rebranding, and a fondness for glossy PR over grounded teaching. A new head teacher, Mr. Swaby, had been brought in to oversee the transition. His welcome speech was expertly crafted, full of phrases like driving standards and raising aspirations, delivered with a practiced calm that projected certainty. But beneath the polish, there was little substance. George hadn't always been a teacher. He'd started his working life in the Royal Air Force. Like his father, and his father before him, he'd joined the forces not to chase a dream, but to follow a legacy. That's what Pembroke men did. "It's in the blood, son," his father once said, sharpening a crease with the side of his hand. "Some things aren't choices. They're callings." George had a steady career, rising to the rank of Flight Lieutenant. But he didn't remember the promotions. He remembered the silence, the heavy static of a radio signal gone dead. It was late autumn, 1985. A routine low-altitude mission over the Outer Hebrides, cold skies, clean lines, nothing out of the ordinary. George had been scheduled to fly, but a minor engine fault had grounded his aircraft at the last minute. He was told to stand down, and Edward Carmichael, Ned to everyone, took his place. From the tarmac, George watched the jet arc westward, sunlight glinting off its wings as it slipped into the clouds. It never came back. The cause was never certain. Weather? Mechanical failure? A navigational slip? Nothing was ever confirmed. The inquiry offered little more than condolences and a quiet tightening of protocols. At the funeral, George stood in dress blues while a lone bugler played the last post. Eloise, Ned's widow, fixed her gaze on the Union Jack-draped coffin with a stillness that held George in place. He'd tried to speak to her after, to express his condolences. "Eloise, I'm so sorry, it should have been—" But she shook her head and turned away before he could finish. That image never left him. He relived it for years. Blame? Grief? Unspoken forgiveness? Her silence said more than words ever could. It was Margaret, his wife, who helped him live with that silence. They'd met during George's early days in the RAF. Margaret was a trainee nurse working at the local hospital near the barracks. He'd been playing second violin in the RAF swing band at the officers' mess. At the back of the room, Margaret stood quietly and smiled at him. George barely remembered the rest of the performance, only that he needed to speak to her. He found her afterward, asked a clumsy question about the music, and she answered with another smile. They spoke again the next day, then the day after that. What followed wasn't dramatic, just a gentle familiarity that deepened with each day. Long postings and time apart came with the job, but to anyone who knew them, it was always clear. They were meant to be together. There had been a time they thought there might be children, quiet hopes tucked between postings and long-distance calls. But the years passed, and the hopes softened into something else. Shared rituals, easy silence, a home built from the life they had, not the one they'd once imagined. Now retired, Margaret volunteered 3 days a week at a local community cafe, a quiet, charity-run space where people came for tea, cake, and conversation without judgment. She rarely offered advice unless asked. Mostly she listened. She remembered names, never rushed anyone, and always got the tea just right. People trusted her, even if they couldn't always explain why. Margaret appeared in the doorway, already dressed. She took one look at George and tilted her head with a knowing expression. "You've got that look, George Pembroke. The one that says today's already gone sideways before you've given it a chance." "Morning, dear," he said, still focused on his task. "I've no idea what makes you think that." His polishing grew brisker, as if keeping his hands busy might keep his doubts at bay. Margaret folded her arms. "You said you'd feel better after a good night's sleep." He set the cloth down. "I thought I would. But the moment the light came through the blinds, so did the worry. We've talked about this, George. You must have seen 10 head teachers come and go in your time there. Swaby is just the next suit in line. A few staff room whispers have never rattled you like this before. You normally just brush them off as static." George stopped his hand mid-circle and looked up. "Because these aren't just whispers. I've read the memo about the strategic review of the timetables. Swaby keeps using words like efficiency and streamlining, and let's be honest, it's never maths, English or science that bear the brunt of it. You're jumping to conclusions. Every new head teacher reviews the curriculum and budget. It's standard procedure. It doesn't mean the axe is falling. They might just be looking for a more modern approach. Syllabus styles do change, as you well know, George. With men like Swaby, a change of syllabus is usually just a polite term for taking a sledgehammer to a load-bearing wall and calling it an open-plan renovation. Decisions have been made somewhere, even if no one said it outright. And when things get vague, things go wrong. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "You can't control everything, George. No matter how hard you hold the line, things can still slip through." He didn't answer, but the line of his jaw tightened. "It's the students as well. They used to come in with a bit of curiosity. You could feel it. They wanted to learn. Now they turn up half shut, phone in one hand, excuse in the other. Everyone's tired and defensive, and the moment you ask for effort, it's like you've insulted their human rights." Margaret held his gaze. "It's not all about you, George. I know it feels personal sometimes, but it isn't. These kids, they're not all coming in from calm, ordered lives. It's messy for a lot of them. And yes, that's no excuse, but it is part of the picture. Sometimes there's a reason for what you see, even if they can't explain it. Whether they show it or not, some of them do appreciate what you bring to the classroom." George gave a short huff. "They've got a funny way of showing it. Come on, you know as well as I do that plenty of your students go on to do well. You're letting a noisy minority cloud your judgment. Then why is it that the moment I step into the room, I feel like the villain in the story? No one said you're the enemy, George, but the world you started teaching in isn't coming back. Times have changed." He gave a theatrical sigh. "Maybe I'll wear a baseball cap back to front, call myself DJ Pembroke, and see if that gets their attention." Margaret let out a snort of laughter. "Now that I'd pay to see." George chuckled too, the moment of levity cutting through the heaviness in the room. "I'm sorry, Margaret," he said softly. "I didn't mean to snap." Margaret smiled. "You always tell your students that when the piece gets complicated, focus on the melody. Maybe you should take your own advice. Forget the politics, George. Just teach the music." George gave a faint nod, not quite convinced, but taking it in. "Said, do you remember your first words as you left the house on your first day teaching?" George narrowed his eyes. "No, but I'm sure you're about to remind me." She took a sip of coffee, enjoying the moment. Ready to mould brilliance from raw clay. He let out a small laugh despite himself. "So I did." The tension eased from his shoulders as he looked at her. The woman who had heard every version of his frustration over the past 30 years and still met each one with patience, clarity, and just enough humor to disarm him. "Well, whatever today brings, it can't be as bad as last year," Margaret said with a wry smile. George didn't answer. His mind had already begun to drift, quietly, unavoidably, back to the first day of term last year. His violin made a noise it was never meant to make, raw and scraping. Laughter exploded around him, fast and full, like someone had flipped a switch. George didn't move. He simply lowered the instrument, rolled his shoulders, and turned away from them. His jaw was tight, his pulse quicker than it should have been. It was just a prank. He knew that. But something inside him still locked up, an instinct too deep to unlearn. Let one slide, and the cracks would follow. He turned back to the class, tuning the violin as if nothing had happened. Around him, laughter still clung to the walls. Wide grins, red faces, the shared thrill of a prank well played. But George wasn't interested in the noise. He was looking for guilt. It took him seconds. Two boys at the back, Danny and Frankie, were laughing, but not like the others. Theirs had an edge to it, quieter, controlled, the kind of laughter that watched for a reaction. George looked at them, calm and even. "Any idea," he said, "why my violin now sounds like a seagull trapped in a wheelie bin?" Danny shrugged, grinning. "Dunno, sir. Maybe atmospheric pressure." He could barely get the words out without laughing. George gave a tight smile. "Ah, of course. Leave a violin unattended and the wind takes artistic liberties." "Stranger things have happened," Frankie muttered. "Anyway, why are you picking on us? Could have been anyone. Where's your evidence for this?" "Yeah," Danny added quickly. "You can't just accuse us." From the side of the room, another voice chimed in. "Yes, sir, that's not fair. Victimization, that is. You should be reported." George kept his composure. "So you're absolutely certain it wasn't you? And the violin just spontaneously retuned itself into an unplayable mess?" Danny folded his arms. "That's what we've been saying, sir." George kept his tone light, almost conversational. "Okay, before we spiral any further into conspiracy theories, you might be interested to know that CCTV now covers all corridors. It was installed over the summer. A safeguarding initiative, apparently, but since the door was left ajar, the lens happens to have a rather perfect view of my desk, and, crucially, anyone standing next to it." Danny and Frankie both visibly blanched. George gave them one last look. "Final time I'm going to ask, was it you?" It was a silence George recognized all too well. A charged stillness that came just before consequences. The air in the room felt tight. Every student had that same look, wide-eyed, motionless, calculating just how bad this was going to get. Danny slumped in his chair, the fight draining from his face. "All right," he muttered. "Yeah, it was us." Frankie didn't speak, but he gave a shallow nod, eyes fixed on the desk. George said nothing for a moment. He just looked at them, long enough to make it uncomfortable, but not cruel. "Thank you for your honesty," he said, "although I do wonder how quickly we'd have arrived at it without the promise of CCTV footage." Both boys looked away, their smirks gone. He picked up a whiteboard marker and wrote on the board in calm, deliberate strokes, "Respect." "Your punishment," he said, turning back to them, "is a 500-word essay on this subject, respect. For instruments, for your classmates, for yourselves. Due Friday, no excuses." A couple of students snorted quietly at that. But the mood had shifted. The laughter was gone. The line had been drawn. George scanned the room once more. "Anyone else want to test the tuning?" Silence. He gave a single nod, lifted the violin again, and tucked it under his chin. "Right. Let's try that again." George blinked, the kitchen coming back into focus. He shook his head at the memory, lips tightening. "Time to go. Mustn't be late for the opening act." Margaret leaned against the counter. "You've sat through 30 years of first-day speeches, George. Surely you can survive one more." "It's not the speech that worries me. It's what Swaby doesn't say. The man speaks in headlines, Margaret. I'm just waiting to read the small print." "Then wait until you actually see it," she said, smoothing down a crease in his shirt. "Don't go writing the tragedy before the curtain's even gone up." George gave a non-committal grunt. She didn't press, just watched him for a moment and said, "Well, go in civil and come out standing." He set his shoes neatly on the floor beside him, sliding his feet into the freshly polished leather, tapping each heel once for good measure. "Don't forget your lunch," Margaret said, handing him a brown paper bag from the counter. He smiled, receiving it with a nod, then said more gently, "Sorry, Bit prickly this morning. Margaret touched his arm. It's the first day. It always pulls at something. He leaned in and kissed her cheek. Have a good day. You too, she said, her voice warm. He nodded, strode into the hallway, stopped at the mirror, straightened his tie, and gave himself a final, approving nod. First impressions, he murmured to himself. With that, he picked up his briefcase and opened the front door. Margaret's voice rang out from the kitchen. Watch out for the unmoldable clay. The mix of duty, dread, and stubborn hope settled over him once more. Chapter 2. The Bigger Picture. George lived in a quiet cul-de-sac, where the lawns were neatly clipped, the bins kept out of sight, and the occasional cat sauntered across the road, as if the whole street existed for its convenience. It was a neighborhood that suited him, a place where unspoken rules still held sway and people took pride in getting things right. His commute marked a steady descent, from a place of order to one where structure seemed optional. First came the village centre, still clinging to its charm. A butcher, a baker, and a few shops that hadn't yet surrendered to chain branding. Then came the outskirts, what George privately called the Wild West. Estates tumbled across the landscape without logic, as if dropped from a great height. Cars wore layers of muck like they'd given up trying to be respectable, and bins loitered on pavements like bored teenagers with nowhere to be. Pride hadn't vanished. It had simply never been invited in. St. Bartholomew's finally loomed into view. A mismatched sprawl of glass and concrete grafted onto the red brick dignity of its original shell. George sighed, bracing himself as he turned through the gates. He parked straight and square, then glanced at two vehicles half stranded on the curb. The art department strikes again, he muttered, locking his car with a decisive click. As he strode toward the main building, his eyes swept over the students trickling through the gates. A girl with hair dyed a lurid shade of green strolled in, oversized headphones clamped over her ears. Her vacant expression suggested she was anywhere but here. Just ahead, a boy staggered past, clutching an energy drink like his life depended on it. Then across the car park, a bleary-eyed parent, still in pajamas, leaned out of their car window, mumbling something halfway between a goodbye and a warning. George squared his shoulders and made his way toward the entrance. The building's confusion didn't end at the front door. Attempts at modernization clashed awkwardly with the past. Interactive whiteboards bolted onto walls that once held chalk-dusted blackboards. Motion sensor lights that flickered like they had stage fright. A fresh coat of paint that never quite masked the lingering scent of old books and teenage apathy. He made his way to the main hall, exchanging a few nods and quiet greetings before slipping into a spare seat near the back. The hall had changed very little since George first arrived. Dark, glossy paneling still lined the walls, and the high-arched ceiling held the faint echoes of long-forgotten performances. The stage, once the domain of Shakespeare, Sondheim, and nervous Year Nines, now hosted PowerPoint presentations and bullet point targets. The air was thick with the scent of wood polish and instant coffee, and the chairs creaked in protest, as if even they weren't ready for the term to begin. Swaby walked onto the stage smiling, as though he'd just been named Employee of the Month at the Ministry of Spin. He tapped the microphone twice, soft and deliberate, before speaking. "Welcome back, everyone," he called, his voice ringing out across the hall. He opened his arms as though greeting survivors of a long and perilous expedition, rather than a room full of staff who had spent the last 6 weeks blissfully forgetting that alarm clocks existed. "Let me start by congratulating you all for last year's efforts. Our GCSE results were strong, up 2% in core subjects, which is fantastic. But as all of you know, the school has ambitious targets for the coming year. We need to keep pushing, raising expectations across the board to ensure every student reaches their full potential." George raised an eyebrow, his pen hovering just above his notepad. A 2% rise, brought about by a 20% rise in workload. The Trust has identified literacy as a key driver of academic success. Research shows that strong reading skills enhance critical thinking, problem-solving, and overall student engagement. With that in mind, we'll be embedding reading strategies into every aspect of the curriculum. Training sessions will support this rollout and ensure consistent application across departments. Swaby paused. And finally, he shifted his tone to one of more gravity now, as if unveiling a state secret. To ensure we maximize curriculum time for our students, we are making structural changes to how we deliver the arts. George's grip on his pen tightened. After Christmas, music and drama will be merged into a single subject called creative synergy. George stared at the stage. Creative synergy. It sounded like a corporate retreat, not an art form. I know change can be daunting, Swaby said, looking every bit the man who found upheaval exhilarating. But this model prioritizes core subjects while streamlining our creative offer. It reduces timetable pressure and drives interdisciplinary work. Transferable skills. Future-proofed learning. The data supports it. The back of George's neck prickled. He held his expression, though every word grated. Around him, the atmosphere shifted as shoulders straightened and eyes narrowed. A few glanced sideways, silently calculating what it might mean for them. Swaby closed with a flourish. Let's make this year our best yet. A smattering of polite applause followed. George did not join in. He gathered his things without a word and headed for the staff room, his footsteps clipped and careful. Like a man who could already smell the rain, even if the sky was clear. The staff room was still settling back into itself after summer. The sink already playing host to an abandoned mug, and the sofas bearing the shape of 100 exhausted teachers. The notice boards sagged under curling memos, passive-aggressive reminders, and sun-faded motivational posters that looked like they'd long since stopped believing in themselves. George took up his usual spot by the window, tracking the slow drip of staff arriving. Post-briefing energy was always the same. Low voices, furrowed brows, people trying to decide how worried to be. He was doing the same. A tall, energetic man walked in wearing a shirt so loud it could have been an art project. George didn't recognize him. But something about the easy grin, the shirt, and the general air of modern teaching told him everything he needed to know. He stood up and made his way to the coffee machine. The ancient contraption groaned in protest before sputtering out a reluctant trickle of something brown. Reliable as ever, George muttered. At least the coffee machine failed in the same predictable way every time. School leadership, on the other hand, liked to get creative. The young man stepped up beside him. Morning, I'm Tom, the new drama teacher. George turned with a small nod. It was the man in the shirt. George Pembroke. Music. They shook hands, firm, brief. Apparently, we'll be working quite closely after Christmas, Tom added. So we've just been told, George said. Tom smiled. I've always thought the two subjects should speak to each other more, drama and music. It's all rhythm, story, expression. George studied him for a moment. That was more considered than he'd expected. Tom shrugged. It's early days. I'm still learning names, timetables, where the loos are. But I'm hoping we can work together to build something that feels relevant. Let the kids connect with it on their terms. George gave a small nod. Ambitious. Tom's expression didn't change. Well, if you're not aiming high, what's the point? He glanced at the clock. I've got year 8 first thing. I want to get them straight into improvisation. Wake them up a bit. I better get a move on. My room's just down from yours, George said, still cautious. If you need anything... Thanks, I might take you up on that. Nice to meet you, George. You too? George watched him leave. He seemed eager, thoughtful, a little too hopeful, probably harmless. But they'd be working closely soon. And George wasn't convinced they spoke the same language. He finished the last of his coffee and made his way toward the staff room door. As he stepped out, he saw Swaby approaching from down the corridor. "Ah, Mr. Pembroke. Perfect timing," he said brightly. "Would it be convenient for me to stop by your room at break for a quick word? I imagine you have a few questions." George nodded. "Morning, sir. I expected there might be more to say." Swaby smiled smoothly, stepping past him. "Absolutely. Details will follow, George. For now, it's best to focus on the bigger picture." George watched him retreat down the corridor, all polished confidence and careful smiles. He adjusted his tie, took a breath, and headed to his classroom. Chapter 3. A Day Out of Tune. The students filed in ahead of George, who followed and shut the door behind them with a purposeful click. The classroom looked exactly as it had when he left it. Desks arranged in neat, symmetrical rows. A whiteboard trimmed with laminated motivational quotes, each one more enduring than inspiring. Along the far wall stretched a display titled Structure and Sound, from Baroque to Modern, complete with staff lines, diagrams, and border trim so straight it might pass a military inspection. At the front, the orchestra rules hung framed in black and gold, less a suggestion, more a decree. George regarded it with the same weight he gave school policy, but with fewer loopholes and considerably less waffle. The students shuffled into their seats. Low conversations hummed at the edges. At two desks, however, heads were bowed, thumbs flicking at screens with the focus of surgeons. George's eyes locked on them. "Miss Anderson, Mr. Taylor," he said, voice clipped. "Lovely to see some of us easing back in gently. Texting Beethoven, are we, or consulting Mozart about the seating plan? If they reply, do let me know." Nick and Lily glanced up, caught. A guilty look passed between them. "It was music-related, sir. Honest," Lily said, leaning back in her chair. George folded his arms. "Well, that changes everything. Do enlighten me." "I was making a playlist of songs we could try to learn this year," she replied, half grinning. "Last year's stuff was a bit dry, no offense." Nick smirked, feeding off Lily. "Yes, we're helping, sir." A few chuckles rose up. "A collaborative effort," George said, his tone cool. "How generous." The laughter died back. George let the silence stretch just enough to itch. "Groundbreaking work. Sadly, it still earns you a detention. Monday, after school. Bring your playlist." Lily sighed long and loud. "Just trying to help, sir." George gave her a flat look. "If I believed for a second you were curating a syllabus and not watching TikToks, I might be inclined to reconsider." Laughter came from the back, but George didn't smile. "The next phone I see earns a 500-word essay on how Mozart composed symphonies without one." Second period arrived with its own challenge. Year 8. There were many ways to wear a teacher down, but none quite so efficient as this particular class. They weren't badly behaved, not exactly. They simply specialized in absence, of energy, of interest, of detectable life. George stood at the front, marker in hand. "Today," he began, "we start a new topic, rhythm. Without it, music is guesswork. With it, even silence means something." From the back, a mutter floated forward, low, flat. "Here we go again. What's the point?" George paused, turning slowly. "Who said that?" Silence met him. Eyes darted sideways, but no one spoke. The class held its breath, bracing for the reprimand. But George didn't shout. He simply placed the marker down and rested both hands on the edge of the desk. The atmosphere shifted, just enough for a few students to sit up straighter. "You want the point?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "All right, I'll tell you." He held their gaze for a second, then straightened up. "When I was a little older than you are now, I joined the RAF. It wasn't like the movies. No jet engines, no sunglasses. Just repetition. Drills, folding, marching. Over and over until your muscles figured it out. Long before your brain did." He stepped out from behind the desk, hands in pockets. That's rhythm. Not just in music, in life. Learning to move in time with others, to know your place in the pattern, to step forward when needed, and to hold back when you must. He gave them a second to let his words land. "Today, you'll be working in groups. You'll build something that only works if everyone does their bit. You'll get it wrong. You'll argue. You'll try again. That's the point. Because real rhythm, the kind that matters, gets you through when everything else is coming apart." A hand went up from Lottie Healy on the second row. "Sir, does silence count if it's part of the pattern?" George blinked, slightly caught off guard by the question. "Yes," he said. "It's part of the rhythm. Sometimes it matters most when everything else stops." Lottie gave a small nod and looked down again. The room grew quiet, not bored or restless, just still. And for a moment, George let it sit. Something tugged behind his ribs, not sharp, just there, sudden and solid. Can I still do this? It didn't creep in. It landed, clear, uninvited, and harder than it should have. And for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure. Break time came, and Swaby entered. The suit was sharp, but it was his voice that had been custom fit. He scanned George's classroom like someone inspecting a house they had already planned to gut. "First morning back, settling into it?" he said, with the tone of a man asking out of habit more than interest. George sat still for a moment, then replied, "I'd say it's been informative." "A useful attitude, George," Swaby said smoothly. "It sets the tone. Students pick up on that." George said nothing. Clearly, Swaby had interpreted informative as receptive. A shame, really. To George, the morning had felt more like a warning shot. "With the new model coming in, I wanted to make sure you had a clear picture," Swaby said, calm but direct. "It touches your area, and early clarity helps." "Understood," George replied stiffly. "My main concern is whether students will still be able to study music and drama separately at G, CSE and A-level, or if we're moving toward a structure where those choices quietly disappear to make more room for core subjects." Swaby nodded, hands loosely clasped. "Completely fair concern, George, and just to be clear, there's no current intention to limit student choice." He smiled, just enough to suggest reassurance. "This model gives us the chance to rethink delivery, to make the creative offer more cohesive, more in tune with what students actually need. It's not about cutting options, it's about evolving how they're structured." He paused, like he'd landed on something significant. "And yes, core subjects are still a national priority, but that doesn't mean creativity gets pushed aside. If anything, this model keeps it in the conversation." George watched him closely. If he ever fancied a change of career, that masterful ability to answer a question without actually saying anything would make him a fine MP. "Thank you, sir, though I'm curious why this morning is the first I've heard of it." "Fair question, George. The truth is, these decisions often come down quickly. Trust-level direction, tight timelines. It's not always possible to have every voice at the round table, even when we want to." He held George's gaze just long enough to suggest sincerity. "But that's why I'm here now, to make sure your voice is part of what comes next. You know this place. You know the students. And with you and Tom working together, I think there's a real opportunity to shape something strong. George had always believed in building things, but rarely by committee, and never by surprise. Swaby stood, smoothing his jacket. I hope this has been helpful, and that I've settled any concerns. My door's always open, George. I genuinely see this as an exciting step forward, for the arts and for the school. George paused. Thank you for coming, he said evenly. He watched Swaby leave, then glanced at the clock. Break was over. By the start of third period, George stood at the front of his next class, holding up a CD. Today, class, we're going to do some listening exercises, he announced, hovering over the ancient CD player. Pay close attention to the allegretto movement. It's a masterclass in building emotional tension. The excerpt will play several times, and I want you to answer questions 1 to 5 on the sheet in front of you. He pressed play. The machine whirred, groaned, and finally produced a sound, somewhere between a dial-up modem and a robot with stage fright. The class burst out laughing before a voice from the doorway cut through the noise. Need any help, Mr. Pembroke? George turned to see Tom leaning casually against the doorframe, a friendly smile in place. Has it given up? I can grab my Bluetooth speaker if that helps, Tom offered. George glanced at him. His stubbornness warred with logic. It was a reasonable offer and probably the easiest solution. He forced a polite smile. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Amory, George said. There are other tasks I can give them for now. But if it insists on being difficult, I might take you up on that speaker later. Was there something you needed? Tom chuckled softly. It's okay. I can see you've got your hands full. I'll come back later. The speaker's on my desk if you change your mind, he said before disappearing into the corridor. As the door swung shut behind Tom, a student, Martin, raised his hand, smirking. Sir, be honest. Is the reason you turned the speaker down because you don't know what Bluetooth is? You do know that's how we do things these days, right? Laughter rippled through the room. George's expression remained unreadable as he folded his hands behind his back. Ah, yes, Bluetooth, he mused. The revolutionary technology responsible for teenagers blasting terrible music from portable speakers on public transport. I'm quite familiar, thank you. Martin grinned, caught between amusement and mild defeat. Unless, of course, I'm wrong and you'd like to educate me. In that case, I'll look forward to reading your 300-word essay on the evolution of audio technology. George cast a glance at the ancient CD player. It had survived budget cuts, upgrades, and at least one colleague's accidental attempt to make it disappear. Now, like him, it was close to giving up. The final lesson of the day had barely begun when George noticed Megan Harper hunched over her desk, scribbling furiously. He walked forward, arms folded. Miss Harper, since you're clearly engaged in something more pressing than today's lesson, why don't you share it with the class? Megan froze. Then, without looking up, she snapped the notebook shut. It's nothing, sir. George extended a hand. Nothing should have no problem being shared, then. After a moment's hesitation, Megan handed it over. He flipped to the most recent page and stopped. There in heavy pencil strokes was a caricature. George, baton raised, face grave. Above it, in block capitals, read, Mr. Pembroke, bet his violin's the only thing that's ever touched him. He'd handled worse, usually with a joke or a calm takedown about boundaries. But this one didn't go after the teacher. It went after the man. George closed the notebook with quiet precision. Detention, he said in a clipped voice. No lesson, no lecture, just the weight of everything finally settling. The final bell rang, and the students made their way out of George's classroom, a steady exodus of bags slung over shoulders and hurried goodbyes. George watched them go, arms crossed. The day had been exhausting. The sudden stillness was almost a relief. No noise, no questions, no interruptions, just a moment to gather himself. Then came a knock at the door. George closed his eyes briefly, as if summoning patience from whatever reserves he had left. "Come in," he called, voice steady but weary. Standing in the doorway was Lottie Healy. "Miss Healy, shouldn't you be on your way home by now?" he asked, tilting his head. Lottie hesitated before stepping inside. "I wanted to ask you something, sir, about music." George straightened slightly, his curiosity piqued. "Okay then, what can I help you with?" Lottie shifted her bag on her shoulder, as if steadying herself. "It's about the violin." George raised an eyebrow. "The violin?" She nodded. "Yes, sir. I want to learn properly. I want to be good. Really good." George felt the weight of his frustration lift. He studied her carefully, not just the words, but the way she said them. There was no bravado, no empty enthusiasm, just a quiet determination. A slow smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Then let's see what we're working with." He stood, crossed the room, and opened a cupboard. Inside sat an old but well-loved violin case. He placed it carefully on the desk in front of her, flicking the clasps open. The violin gleamed inside, its polished wood catching the last of the afternoon light. Lottie's eyes widened as her hands hovered over it, hesitant. "Can I try?" "5 minutes," George said, nodding. "Let's see if you and the violin agree. Then we can talk about lessons going forward." She lifted it with careful hands, placing it under her chin. Her grip was uncertain, her posture stiff, but her focus was unwavering. "Relax your shoulder," George instructed, stepping forward. "If you hold it too tightly, you'll fight the instrument instead of playing it." Lottie adjusted her posture, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Good," he said. "Now, the bow. Wrist loose, let it glide. Don't force it." She hesitated, then drew the bow across the strings. The first note wavered, thin and uncertain. The second was steadier. The third, a hint of control. George watched in silence, a familiar feeling stirring, one he hadn't had in years. And in that moment, he could almost hear his father's voice. "Every great musician starts here, George." For the first time that day, he allowed himself a real smile. Maybe, just maybe, music wasn't lost after all. Chapter 4. The Grand Conductor. The front door clicked shut, its familiar echo carrying through the house. A moment later came the quiet shuffle of George removing his shoes. He was greeted by the warm aroma of roasted vegetables mingling with the earthy tang of fresh herbs, wrapping the hallway in a comforting cocoon of scent. "Ah, the Grand Conductor returns," Margaret called down the hallway, her voice bright with its usual mix of warmth and teasing. "How was the first day back, leading the symphony of young minds?" George appeared in the doorway. The slump of his shoulders said it all. He set his briefcase on the table with a deliberate thud, then loosened his tie and exhaled. A sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire school day. "Let's call it character building," he said, his tone dry. He rubbed his temples. "Sway B," he began. "The man's a—" He paused, searching for the least damaging word. "Visionary." His word, not mine. Big ideas, slick delivery, and just enough disruption to make it all sound exciting without actually solving anything. He dropped into the nearest chair. "And I was right to be suspicious. It's music he's put on the chopping block. They're merging it with drama. One big happy faculty called creative synergy. Sounds progressive until you realize what it really means." Margaret turned from the stove, raising an eyebrow. "Should I be pouring you a drink or preparing a eulogy?" George let out a short laugh. Depends on whether you think interpretive dance can teach sonata form. Margaret paused, her wooden spoon hovering mid-stir. And what does the drama teacher think of it? He loves the idea, enthusiastic as a puppy with a new toy. George leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. Turned up in a shirt so loud it should have come with a safeguarding notice. Margaret turned slightly, resting the spoon on the edge of the pot. And that bothers you because... George gave a slow shrug. Because he's here to teach, not DJ a barbecue. Margaret raised an eyebrow. You weren't rude, were you? No, he said, frowning. I was polite, professional. Margaret smiled. You always are. But sometimes professional feels like a brush-off, especially when you're the one on the outside. He didn't respond right away, and Margaret didn't push. She just stirred gently, letting the quiet settle. You don't have to like him right away, she said eventually. But it wouldn't hurt to make sure he doesn't think you've already made up your mind. George leaned back further in his chair. Maybe I have. Margaret turned, crossing her arms. Then maybe give him the same grace you got when you switched careers and walked into the staff room for the first time. That gave him pause. The RAF to the classroom hadn't been an easy jump. And for the record, she added with a grin, I would love to see you teach a sonata through interpretive dance. George let out a reluctant laugh. That'll be the day they finally wheel me out of the building. So, apart from the inevitable destruction of the music department, how was the rest of your day? So much to choose from, George said dryly. But watching a 20-year-old CD player die in front of a class felt oddly symbolic. Margaret let out a small laugh. Your sense of humor's still intact, I see. Oh, and let's not forget my students' ever-growing artistic talents. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a notebook, and flipped it open to a page near the back. Margaret took one look and burst out laughing. Is that... Me, George said flatly. She wiped a tear from her eye. It's uncanny. Leaning in slightly, she squinted at the writing above the drawing. Excuse the commentary, George added, his voice dry. Typical teenage charm. Mr. Pembroke, bet his violin's the only thing that's ever... The words died in her throat as the meaning landed. Her smile faded. George closed the notebook with a quiet snap. The shading's not bad, though, he murmured, looking away. Margaret didn't respond. She glanced at him, saw the tension still sitting just behind his eyes, and said nothing. She turned back to the stove, giving him space. George sat for a moment, his thumb resting on the edge of the notebook. A moment passed before he glanced over, his expression softening. And what about you? How was your day? Margaret smiled, grateful for the pivot. Oh, you know, quite boring in comparison, but book club was lively. Jean Patterson is still furious that we picked a thriller instead of a historical romance. George chuckled. Jean Patterson has opinions on everything, except the book she's meant to be reading. She certainly does. Oh, and I called in on Helen to see how she's recovering from her hip replacement. She's doing well, back to bossing David around the house again. Good to hear, George said, nodding. Helen without bossing David is like Jean Patterson without historical romance. Unthinkable. Margaret smirked. You and Jean Patterson should start a club. People deeply offended by change. George smiled, then exhaled slowly. I began to doubt myself today. Wondered if I still have something to offer. If maybe my way of teaching doesn't belong in today's classroom anymore. Margaret's expression softened, but before she could speak, George continued. But then, at the very end of the day, there was one glimmer of hope. "Oh?" she asked, curiosity in her eyes. "Lottie Healy," George said, the name steady in his mouth. "Year 8, quiet girl but very keen. She wants to learn the violin." He paused. Held the instrument like it meant something. Margaret set the ladle on the counter and turned, giving him her full attention. "She reminded me of students gone by," he added. Not in how she looked, just in how she listened. Margaret crossed to him, placed a hand on his shoulder, and gave it a gentle, familiar squeeze. Her voice was soft but sure. "They're still out there, George, even if they're harder to find these days. She sounds like the kind of student every teacher hopes for." George scoffed under his breath, as if to wave it off, but the edge of his mouth betrayed him. The smile wasn't wide, but it was there, creased into the corners of his tired eyes. "She asked if I'd teach her properly. Said she wanted to be good." Margaret didn't reply, just watched him for a moment longer. There was no need. She just gave his shoulder one last squeeze, then turned back toward the kitchen. "Come on," she said. "Let's get you some dinner before orchestra rehearsal. Wouldn't want you missing the highlight of your week." George smirked. A room full of musicians who actually want to be there. What a novelty. Margaret shot him a look over her shoulder. "They want to be there, do they? Then you'd better not be late, Maestro."